This week on the Communicators, a look at cybersecurity with two business executives involved in safeguarding communication systems. They also talk about federal regulation of their industry.
And now we want to introduce you to Robert Dix, who is Vice President of Juniper Networks. And recently, Mr. Dix, you testified at a House hearing on cybersecurity.
Yes, sir.
What was your message to the members of the Energy and Commerce Subcommittee?
It's really important at the time of this challenge that we are facing in cybersecurity that we maintain an environment that facilitates investment and innovation and doesn't do anything to confine the ability of the private sector, which owns and operates the majority of the networks upon which all critical infrastructure and most of the things we have come used to in our daily lives rely on, from having their attention directed away from being nimble, agile, and fast to respond to this challenge as it continues to grow.
And is that in direct reference to the White House plan that was introduced last year on cybersecurity, which puts an emphasis on DHS?
It certainly responds to it around the parameters that have been outlined in some of the legislative initiatives that we've seen.
Do you expect cybersecurity legislation to move through the Congress this year?
Well, my crystal ball is a little cloudy about that. I have reason to believe that there will be a legislative initiative that will be introduced on the Senate side. Not entirely sure what it will look like yet. I believe there may be some pieces of legislation introduced on the House side. Not entirely sure what that looks like yet. What's really important here and what's valuable is that we're having a dialogue in a different way than we have in the past. And we're trying to drive towards adding some arrows to the quiver that can help us fight this fight. We may not always agree on that path forward, but having this dialogue and finding our common ground is extremely important at the time that the adversaries are getting more sophisticated.
Mr. Dix, what is Juniper Networks and how would cybersecurity legislation affect your company?
We are one of the world's leaders in trusted high-performance network and security solutions. We are a hardware and software manufacturer. We are involved in data center and virtualization and mobile security. So we span the spectrum of offerings in this space. One of our successes has been that we invest heavily in research and development to drive innovation. We're a US-based company with offices and operations around the world, but we believe innovation is the answer to meeting the challenges of the future. Computing, storage, and networking is changing as we know it, and it's changing rapidly. The only way we're going to be able to respond to that and be able to address the challenges associated with that is to innovate. So we have believed in that investment, and we worry a little bit about anything that may have an unintended consequence of constraining our ability to innovate or taking our eye off the ball of the mission.
And also joining us here on the Communicators is Gautam Nagesh, who is the new editor of CQ's Technology Executive Briefing.
Thanks, Peter. Mr. Dix, the number one question for a lot of Americans unfamiliar with this issue is how serious is the threat when we talk about cybersecurity? Specifically, how far away are we from an attack that could either cause significant physical damage or cripple our nation's economy in some way?
So we always have to be vigilant. The one thing I want to remind everyone, including our viewers today, is that even in recent risk assessments conducted across the IT and telecommunications sectors, we have demonstrated, utilizing a recognized methodology, that the networks we rely on today are resilient. That doesn't mean that they're not subject to attack, but we are resilient. We have built networks that can respond, and we do respond. Folks read a lot of the press about some of the high-profile breaches that we've had. What they don't read too much about is the hundreds of thousands of exploit attempts that we repel every day because we have made these kinds of investments I talked about earlier. What really needs to happen is we need to raise the level of awareness and the consciousness of the American people, from home users to small businesses to the academic community and nonprofits all the way to large enterprises, about how they can better protect themselves in this thing we call cyberspace.
Now, you talk about a lot of deflected attacks, and that's clearly true. We've seen numbers that thousands, if not millions, of attacks are made on U.S. networks every year. But it's also fair to say that it's not how many that are deflected, but how many get through. One attack could foreseeably be enough to cause massive damage. Again, the question is, are we at a place where a cyber attack could result in the loss of lives or perhaps billions of dollars of damage to our economy?
I always worry about that risk. I would like to believe that the resilient nature of that would be in and of itself a deterrent. However, as I mentioned earlier, the adversaries that we're dealing with today are more committed, better resourced, and becoming more sophisticated. So we talk about the advanced persistent threat. I worry about that, and I worry about whether or not we are actually paying sufficient attention to that. But let's remember this, the point of entry, this is what we don't talk enough about. The point of entry oftentimes is at the very low level. So botnets, as an example, are generally the result of home computers that are overtaken by the adversary because of a poor or lack of hygiene on those units. And it's not because people aren't interested in protecting themselves, they don't know how. Small businesses are also ripe victims for getting into the supply chain, as an example. So we have to take care of raising the bar, and cyber hygiene is one of the ways to do that. That's about 80% of the issue. The other 20% is tougher and more sophisticated. What I'm happy to report to you is there are extraordinary efforts underway with the public and private sector working together to address some of those more sophisticated threats.
Now, on that 80% issue, we've seen a campaign really on the part of Congress to raise awareness of cybersecurity as an issue, to make Americans aware that they need to safeguard their information. We've also seen some rather heated rhetoric behind this issue, talk of a cyber 9/11 behind one of the sponsors from the Senate cybersecurity bill. That rhetoric seems a little bit out of line with the threat that you're laying out for us today. How do you reconcile the two?
There's a lot of hype around this issue, and some people are driving a particular agenda, and that's fine. And I don't want to minimize the risk here, but this is, again, about managing risk. We can't protect everything all the time. Right now, I don't believe we're doing a very good job of the basic blocking and tackling of cyber hygiene, of education and awareness, of creating an operational capability so that we can improve upon detection, prevention, and mitigation. Today, we still spend a lot of our time, energy, and resources around response and recovery. We need to build the capability with government and with industry to create something like a National Weather Service or a Center for Disease Control, where we have a nerve center that has the pulse of what's going on networks in a steady state and during any points of escalation. We have the ability to do that, but we have some policy issues in the way, we have some legal issues in the way. It's really not a technology issue. So I think that we need to have a different dialogue around what are some of those impediments to creating an operational capability, to creating a sustained national education and awareness campaign. What are the law enforcement tools that we need that we don't have today? And what are the ways that we might leverage government procurement activity to be able to drive changes in behavior?
Mr. Dix, so how is it that the role of DHS as proposed in the Obama cybersecurity plan, how does that impede what you think should be the goal?
So as an example, there's a recommendation in the legislative initiative under covered critical infrastructure, which in and of itself is not clearly defined as to what would qualify or not qualify, and leaves it to the discretion of the Secretary of Homeland Security in consultation with others to be able to determine that. But it talks about the establishment of cybersecurity performance requirements. It talks about an annual certification process. It talks about third-party assessments to validate that the presumed covered critical infrastructure is meeting the performance measures of those requirements. All of that takes time. Just building the performance requirements and building the compliance model, the regulatory regime that I refer to it as, takes time. And by the time that's complete, the risk has changed so much, it's very dynamic, that probably whatever comes out of that is moot. It's old news. We need to be nimble, fast, and agile in being able to respond to that, which means we need to facilitate greater innovation and the ability of the private sector to have access to threat intelligence information to improve the risk landscape and break down some of the barriers that we have had that impede our ability to collaborate better.
And in fact, in your testimony, your congressional testimony, you said it is imperative that all of us acknowledge that cybersecurity is truly a shared responsibility and that managing risk will require a true collaborative approach between government and the private sector. The private sector owns and drives the majority of the innovation and also owns and operates the majority of our nation's critical infrastructure.
That's correct, and that's why it's absolutely essential that we be at the table and engaged in this dialogue with our counterparts in government. And you know what? That's happening in some places. We have a framework under the National Infrastructure Protection Plan that allows government and industry to work together through sector coordinating councils across the 18 sectors, through information sharing and analysis centers that every day are doing good work about sharing threat and vulnerability information. We need to leverage those relationships that we have built and invested time and resources over the period of their existence and utilize them to the nation's best interest.
Gautam Nagesh.
Now, Mr. Dix, you spoke about the need for information sharing, and there does appear to be bipartisan agreement on that issue, likely to see some legislation move in the House in the near future.
Hope so.
However, speaking to the DHS portion that's been proposed in the White House and the Senate plan, what do you propose beyond the information sharing be substituted for audits or some sort of regulation? In other words, how can the federal government be sure that critical parts of the infrastructure are being protected without implementing some sort of regulation?
So there are parts of the Senate bill that I think have merit. There is a section that talks about a sector-by-sector risk assessment. Excuse me, I have firsthand knowledge of work that's been done in the information technology and communication sectors to conduct such sector-wide risk assessments, utilizing recognized methodologies, an attack tree process to identify high-risk activities that need to be identified. Now, remember, in IT and comms, it's more about functions than it is about assets. But all 18 sectors of the critical infrastructure community have been engaged in some type of risk assessment. So working with our government partners in a collaborative way to take a look at those risk assessments, identify gaps, what are the protective measures that we can recommend across the members of those sectors, and where are the gaps that require research and development. These are kinds of things that we can be doing together. So I think that's a good part of the bill, and I like that piece of it, and it talks to the broader range of the risk that we need to try and manage without drilling down and telling individual companies the things that they need to do to manage risk in their own environments.
But under that suggestion, if a company were to have gaps in their protections identified and they weren't able to address it, either from cost issues, which have been cited by industry, or other reasons, what can the government do essentially? Should it be up to the company to leave their systems open to attack, if they decide that the risk doesn't outweigh the cost?
So let's remember that these companies want to stay in business. And staying in business depends on a reputation. And reputation includes the ability to be secure. So companies will make those kinds of investments. In some cases, particularly in small business, they oftentimes don't know what they should be investing in and what are low cost or no cost items that they could be doing to try and help improve their protection profile. That's a place we can help. The Small Business Administration could be engaged in this with us. The Internal Revenue Service, they have engagement with citizens all the time. Lots of things we can be doing together.
Mr. Dix, in your testimony again, you write, in today's increasingly connected world, the move to cloud computing and the explosion in the use and proliferation of mobile devices and applications mean that we must be able to rely on the resilience of the network more than ever. Does this change the equation with the expanding use of the cloud and also the mobile proliferation?
It's a perfect example of what I was talking about. The technology is moving rapidly, and every time the technology changes, the adversary changes their modus operandi to try and take advantage of that. So we need to be able to be nimble and fast. The move to cloud and the virtualization and the use of data is responding to the demands of the users. The increase in data, video, voice is demanding that we have this virtualized capability that is the next iteration. As I mentioned earlier, computing, storage, and networking is changing to be able to deal with the scale and the requirements of the big data. So we need to protect it. Actually, I think that we have a great opportunity with cloud to be able to be more secure. And this is what we need to be able to innovate and stay ahead of and not spend our time, resources, and attention on complying with a regulatory regime.
So, Robert Dix, does this issue stop at our nation's borders? And could more regulations, in your view, make us less economically competitive?
That's part of the problem, is this really is an economic issue and it's about U.S. competitiveness. No, it doesn't stop at the border. This is a borderless challenge. This is a global challenge, and U.S.-based companies dealing around the world have to deal with laws and regulations and requirements of other countries as well. So we need to be cognizant of that in whatever steps that we take and make sure that we're thinking about that in the global context.
Robert Dix is the Vice President of Juniper Networks. And coming up next on the Communicators, we're going to talk with Bill Connor. He is President and CEO of a company called Entrust. He also testified before the Cybersecurity Subcommittee. And now on your screen is Bill Connor. He is president and CEO of a Dallas-based company called Entrust. Mr. Connor, what is Entrust and what do you do?
Well, we're a software security company that focuses on protecting digital identities and digital information. So about half our business is with governments around the world. So everything from your US passport or a UK passport has our technology in it to protect your personal information, to some of the next generation passports in Europe and other places that have biometrics. Here in Washington, as an example, if you're a government employee, your physical logical access card under HSPD 12 uses our technology to protect that and enable it. And banks then use us for securing email to their clients and content, as well as fraud detection or fraud prevention, which is what I was talking today in the committee meeting about.
Well, you did testify at a cybersecurity hearing today, and
Correct.
What was your message to the members of Congress?
Well, what we're trying to do is make it simple. Cybersecurity is a little complex, hard to see until you see the money leave your account, if you're a small business especially. And the question is, what do you do? And what is it and what can I do? So what I wanted to provide is a real example, which is a man-in-the-browser Zeus spy attack that's really crippling small business. And so I explained how that happens, how it's perpetrated, and then what small businesses can do with technology available today to get behind that, and what they need to ask their banks to do to protect them in terms of it. And then we went a little bit wider with, what are the issues in public-private sharing. I co-chaired the public-private partnership at DHS, so a little experience, a few straps on the back in terms of that experience.
The Obama administration came out with a cybersecurity proposal last year. Congress is now looking at actual legislation. What is it about that proposal that you agree with? Where do you disagree?
Well, I won't talk about Obama itself. Let's talk about there's lots of legislation. I think the issue is we need to do more, and it needs to be focused. And it starts with, this is an identity issue. Governments give you your best government protected identities. We've got to take that and make it useful for businesses and in how they use that. Second is, in public-private sharing, when I co-chaired the task force, the first one on this, you can't share information. I'm a security company that most of the government in the U.S. uses for protection. When I go talk to the people that work on cyber threats in those pieces, it's a one-way dialogue, legally. I can give them information, but they can't give me information because of the competitive nature and antitrust and all that. When I work with compadres, CEOs, and other companies on the private side, all the CEOs and presidents can be in agreement until you get the legal team in. And then the minute you guys do something, you've kind of got all kinds of antitrust issues, and more importantly, then you're raising a different standard, be it criminal or civil, of whatever you do that's not out in the standards body or regulation or legal framework.
Also joining us is Gautam Nagesh, editor of CQ's Technology Executive Briefing. Mr. Nagesh.
Thank you. Now, you spoke about the need for, or the result of cooperation being that you're setting a new standard. Who should be in charge of setting that standard? We've seen some debate on that as part of this.
Yeah, I think that's one of the real issues, right? And is it a U.S.-only standard or not? If you look at it, I think you got to be careful to go by what sector you're involved with. Like passports, there is a global standards group, and it's ICAO. They do a great job in terms of first-generation digital passports and the next generation in terms of it. So let's leave that as a global standard. As you come to the U.S., you've got a plethora of standards, some created and embraced by NIST, some that are developed by industries on their own that are de facto standards. And I think NIST has a real role to play in helping us say, what is the floor to what's acceptable in terms of encryption or protection of data, as well as what's the policy procedures behind how you use that.
Of course, setting the floor itself is the base of the controversy about this legislation.
That is correct.
Do you believe that it's necessary for the government to establish a baseline?
Yeah, I do. I really do. And let me tell you why. Today, if you look at one of the most significant pieces of legislation that brought security to the forefront, it was California 1386. Unfortunately, we now have 40 plus states with their own legislation and laws in place. But it said if you encrypted and protected data, you had a carrot and a stick. If you had done that, you didn't have to non-disclose it, you didn't have to disclose it, and you were protected from class action. If you hadn't, then the stick was you're subject to notification and breach and a fine in terms of it in class action. That certainly gets a CEO's attention in the private world. The problem with that is there's over 200 plus encryption standards, some of which may not be useful to our country or the good guys. Forget our country at this point. Well, whose encryption you're using and how you use it and protect it are critically important. And I don't think people want to do the wrong thing. It's just the availability to pick up things that you think are good, but they're not. You need to have someone helping the industry understand what that floor is.
Of course, we saw some of this difficulty in terms of compliance and standards getting outdated with the Federal Information Security Management Act, FISMA,
right, FISMA,
which is also part of the reform proposals from both sides.
That's right.
But the question is then, how do you effectively set these standards, these baselines, in such a dynamic sector where things are changing so quickly, faster than the government?
Yeah, I think that's why I go after the minimum, because I think minimums change a lot less. But if you get them too nebulous, they have no meaning. I know in Washington it's very popular to want to create a cybersecurity organization to oversee this, and I think that's just folly. And the reason I think it's folly is, having done this before, energy and grid and nuclear are very different than financial infrastructure, than telecom, where I grew up, than health, in terms of the information, how the businesses work, the information that's trying to be attacked, and the ultimate risk or liability in terms of the company and the country and the individual. And so I think, I look at the Joint Forces Advisory Board where I serve. I think it's a great model. In that Joint Forces, you still have Army, Air Force, Marines, Coast Guard, and they all have what they're supposed to do best. Joint Forces, though, were to sit and coordinate and look across it, and their best people, and some of the money got carved into that. That doesn't mean I asked DHS or NSA to sit and know more about energy than energy, who already has the relationships and processes and what are the priorities that you need to do. I think we need to lean into that, give them the money, give them the resources, and say take 10% of that and force that between public and private in a meaningful sharing, not just with ISPs. Because here I sit as someone that's supposed to be securing it. Well, carriers are at the endpoint. It's not about an IP address anymore. I mean, that's what's getting knocked off. So that's why I get out of the frameworks that many talk here in Washington, because you got to get into the businesses of what's at risk and how do you deal with that at that level.
And in your testimony at the hearing today, Mr. Connor, you said, what we face is a threatening cyber environment where warfare is being conducted by foreign governments, international crime rings, and common thieves in the U.S. It takes everyone, government, major organizations, small businesses, and individuals working together to defeat these forces. And then you go on to talk about Moore's Law. And we've just been talking about standards and procedures. Are we outdated as soon as we form these standards and procedures?
Yeah, standards by definition are always going to be lagging, because someone's going to get advantage on the good or the bad by, either being pre or post them. And I don't think that's the issue. You still need standards, and you still need a floor to say this is how you operate. I think the difference is, if you allow people to innovate and people like us to do what we do best and take off some of the shackles and share really meaningful content, frankly, not just within the U.S. I mean, we've got 5 intelligence groups around the world that coordinate. You look at defense today, they share some stuff publicly with their companies. They share other stuff not publicly, and they share it across borders with other MODs around the world. Cybersecurity's got to mature the way it did with air, land, and sea. That next battlefront is where we've got to take some of the lessons and just reapply it to a digital age instead of a brick mortar bullets and missiles world.
At today's hearing, or the hearing that you were just testifying at, what level of interest would you say members of Congress have in this issue, and what level of comprehension?
You know, Peter, that's a great question. I'm graying. 11 years of dealing with this subject and being one of the first ones. I saw Goodlatte the day, actually after the piece, the morning after Bush spoke to the joint sessions, I with Goodlatte and Bennett spoke on cyber and the need to start to look at that as a piece. I spoke at NATO. And I look at that today and go, we're still talking. Now, I don't want to take that the wrong way. We've made great strides and great progress. And this is not something like year 2000 that's going to be dealt with once and we're done. It's more like quality. If you look in the last 10 years and the amount of time I spent personally, not for profit, on this subject, you know, it's trying to get a lexicon and understanding just like Deming did with quality. So I think that lexicon in governance and in companies and in governments is way better than it's ever been. But on the corollary, country states and criminal intent organized crime people also understand that they can make money at that ambiguity and peace. And that's the pace that they're at in terms of that understanding. But I think, you know, when I hear stuff like today, when people say, oh, the cost of security is too great, that's what I said today. That's what I heard in quality. What is the cost? Is it really the cost to do it once and to keep it up? Or is it the total cost when it doesn't work? When people started with quality, it was, oh, it's a process and it's too costly, I don't understand it, you know, let's not do it. But, you know, the government was pretty effective in using quality in the bully pulpit, and American business finally got it. They got the lexicon and said, God, it's actually cheaper in the total costs of ownership in terms of that. And I think cybersecurity and all of us have to kind of learn, yeah, this is good for us. It can be a brand differentiator, and the total cost of not being secure is, for those that are now breached, as an individual or a small business or a company, you quickly understand the cost of not being. I mean, as you heard today from the question of Congressman Rogers, I mean, there's companies even in security that are out of business today because they were breached. So I think that's the message that we got to keep focused on is it's not going to go away overnight. What are the things we can do and take that and hopefully up the pace a bit?
And we have time for one more question. Gautam Nagesh.
I think you did just touch upon one of the roots of this debate, which is that industry critical infrastructure providers are really saying that it costs them too much to implement the latest technology or to take the necessary precautions. How do you, as a security expert, evaluate that argument, given, as you said, the potential for catastrophic damage?
Yeah, I think it's how you define cost. You know, economists are going to define it one way, operating guys another. And if you define it as my upfront cost to fix everything, it's a big number. But I would offer to you a lot of what they're spending today is not even relevant. They could cut their cost and be more relevant by using some of the later technologies that could be used to protect their infrastructures.
So it's, in your view, long-term versus short-term planning in this
Absolutely.
case?
Correct.
And we have been talking with Bill Connor, President and CEO of Entrust. Mr. Connor, thank you for coming to the Communicators studio. Gautam Nagesh of CQ, you as well. And this program, as well as the hearing that we have been discussing on cybersecurity, is available to watch online at cspan.org. The hearing was held on February 8th, 2012, and you can search it in our video library there.